Welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and today we are covering the topic of Molinism, and not just any old kind of Molinism. It is mere Molinism, and we'll kind of explain what that is when I invite my guest on in just a few moments. But folks typically like this topic. It's kind of when you talk about Calvinism, whether you love Calvinism, whether you hate Calvinism, it seems that people are always interested in the topic. And I think the same thing with Molinism, whether you love it, whether you hate it, folks find the topic quite fascinating. And so I'm actually really excited to be speaking about this topic today with my guest. And so if I can kind of categorize my favorite topics to discuss, it would probably have to be apologetic methodology. You guys know I'm a presuppositionalist. I love talking about methodological issues. I love talking about the Calvinism issue. I enjoy talking about Molinism a lot. And probably creation, old earth, young earth. Those are the fun, if you want to start a barroom brawl between peace-loving Christians, just bring up one of those topics and you're sure to see some fireworks. So, but there's not going to be any fireworks here. I don't want you guys to get it twisted. I know the thumbnail says "Rest in peace, mere Molinism," but it's kind of tongue in cheek. But that being said, my guest has actually done something quite impressive that I'm looking forward to sharing with you guys, and we'll kind of jump into that topic in detail. So before I invite my guest, Colton Carlson, on, I want to make just a couple of things here that I want you guys to be aware of. Tomorrow, I'm going to be having Eric Hernandez on to talk about apologetics and abortion. So if you're interested in how to do apologetics within the context of discussions on abortion, you're not going to want to miss that discussion. So that's tomorrow at 9 p.m. Eastern. I also am going to be having on Luke Pearson, who is a pastor at Apologia Church over there in Arizona. That is it's a church where James White goes, and there's a pastor, Jeff Durbin is over there. We're going to be talking about apologetics in the local church. That's going to be on June 9th at 9 p.m. Eastern. So looking forward to that. Also, I am holding my online apologetics course that the classes are going to start on June 7th. So if folks are interested in kind of doing a 5-week kind of structured course on presuppositional apologetics, Presup-U, that's what it's called. Folks can actually sign up right now on revealedapologetics.com. And so that sign-up period is going to be open from now all the way up until June 7th. So if you're interested in that, that is a great way to support Revealed Apologetics. It takes a lot of work to prepare for a lot of these things. And so financial support is very, very helpful. So I do appreciate it. However, whether it's donating through the donate page on the website or signing up for a course, all those things are super, super helpful, and it's greatly appreciated. Well, with all of those things out of the way, we have a nice little crowd here. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my guest, Colton Carlson. How are you doing, man?
Doing fantastic. I'm so privileged and honored to be here. So,
well, thank you for that. It's not that big of a deal, but hey, man,
I'm honored.
Okay, that's right.
Eli.
That's right. So I've allowed you to be graced by my presence. All right. Well, why don't you tell folks a little bit about who you are, and then we'll kind of get into what I found quite fascinating is this, I guess this paper that started out kind of like a paper, but kind of turned into a book on the topic that we're going to be discussing. So why don't you share with folks who you are before we get into all that?
Yeah, sure. So, Colton Carlson, I'm a mathematics and philosophy teacher at Mission Heights Preparatory High School. I teach actually in Casa Grande, Arizona, which is around like 30 minutes or so south of Phoenix. I've actually been to Jeff Durbin's church before. I met both him and Luke. Great people. Their apologetics ministry on Mormonism and Latter-day Saints, beautiful. I've learned so many things from them. So so I'm kind of in that same area. I have 2 degrees. So because I'm going to say why I have 2 degrees in a bit, but I have 2 degrees, secondary mathematics education, and then also theology and Bible. So philosophy, what I teach at my charter school is like an elective. So high school philosophy, I teach them kind of like topical scenarios and ethical dilemmas, and teach them a bit about logic and
Sure.
big stuff about philosophy. So,
Yeah.
and my interests include this. So we have similar interests. I'm mainly focused on the free will and responsibility side, and compatibilism, determinism, Calvinism,
Right.
stuff like that. So,
Yeah, just to give folks a heads up, if you're interested in this whole sort of debate, if you guys know, a while back, Tim Stratton debated James White on the topic of is Molinism biblical? And I
mm,
think Colton and Tyler Vela did an excellent
yeah,
job with a three-part review of the debate. Totally not boring. It's fun because they have good chemistry and as they're kind of interacting with each other, but it's also just a really great resource to kind of unpack how one might approach this topic and analyze some of the arguments that Tim puts forth. And of course, this is nothing
mm,
against Tim. I don't want to waste too much time saying this because I know I think we always caveat these sorts of discussions with this, but we think that Tim is a great guy. We just think he's wrong.
yeah,
On this specific topic. So that's all. So there's no, I know he'll probably watch this. But
maybe.
yeah, he will. He will. Trust me, he'll be coming out with a 10-part response video. No, I'm just kidding. Well, he might. Well, you never know. So if God actualizes a world in which he sees it and that's what he wants to do, it'll happen. So
We'll give him glory. So,
that's right. Amen. So what caught my attention, Colton, was that you intended to interact with Tim Stratton's work just kind of briefly. Be like, maybe I'll write an article or something like that, maybe a blog post, and then like a wink, a snap, turn around 3 times, and now you've written a 300-page interaction with what Tim Stratton calls mere Molinism. My question to you is, what the heck, bro?
yeah, I know, right? There's a couple of reasons why. So I did start off like after his book came out, which I was really excited for, but it was just so lackluster and just dull. And I actually have it right here. I'm looking at it. But I went to town on the book. I don't know if you can kind of see some parts, but I did do a lot of highlighting in the book. So I did read it.
Let's get a close up on that later. Maybe
I've
you can.
read a lot of your book.
Okay.
So
All right.
yes.
Oh, nice.
Those of
Okay.
you who don't like writing, shame on you. You should write, and you learn a lot. But I did read it. I probably read it close to 5 times, at least the philosophy and theology sections. But
Sure.
basically, I was so disappointed with it. I was going to do like a 20-page, because I had a lot of personal correspondence with Stratton through like Facebook group and so forth. So I wanted to do like a 20-page kind of, I don't know, review of the book, like I wanted to review it. And then Bignon came out with his review. I'm like, oh, I'm done. I don't need to do it at all. He came out with it on January 1st, 2020. And I was like, this is great. This is basically everything I wanted to say. It's short, concise. I mean, he told everyone to pack a lunch when he sent it out, and I packed a lunch and I enjoyed that. And 2 months later, Stratton, because we all knew he was going to, I was just waiting.
Sure.
He posted a review, or sorry, a rejoinder of Bignon, 50 pages in response. And again, so lackluster, so disappointing with the response. I believe Stratton said one time to Bignon he was unimpressed with Bignon's negative argumentation against the consequence argument. Well, I'm going to return the favor. I was really unimpressed with Stratton's defenses of Bignon. And so to me, I was like, well, then I have to do something. And that's when I started meeting with some other fellow Molenists and incompatibilists. So not just Calvinists, but
Sure.
incompatibilists who had similar views on Stratton's work. And we started kind of talking, and we started developing this kind of friendship, and one thing led to the other. I started writing. 20 pages became 50, 100, 150, 300. It just happens.
You
But
just like jumped from like 50, 100. Yeah, 300.
my life was like when I kept telling her how long it was, and her mouth kept dropping. Like, what? So it's kind of an inside joke, but yeah. So I call it brief. I
Okay.
know if you're the title is called A Brief Philosophical and Dialectical Inquiry on Mere Molinism, a
Mhm.
Compatibilist Reply. So on my preface, I actually, if you go to the link and go to academia and download it, you read my preface, I actually explain all this, but I keep the word brief in the title kind of for like hilarious, sentimental reasons. But also, I think I do it because I kind of do it as a tribute to Vin Inwagen. So Vin Inwagen's famous work, An Essay on Free Will, where he exposits his consequence argument. And when you read it, you're like, this is no essay. This is a whole book, and you're going to town and arguing for
Sure.
incompatibilism. And so I'm kind of like, as a tribute to him, I kept the word brief in there, and I thought
Okay.
it was kind of hilarious and cheeky. So
That's awesome.
yeah,
Now, a quick question. So you described Stratton's book, or I think both his book and his response to Bignon, as
yeah.
lackluster. Now, without getting into the specifics, because you're gonna kind of go into that.
Yeah.
In what sense would you describe both his book and his response as being lackluster? What do you mean by that, and why? And why?
So I'll give one example, I guess. So in personal correspondence with Stratton after his 13 plus hour responses to Bignon in 2020, where you were a part of, I watched all those videos. So when you're interviewing Bignon and their responses back with Flowers, Hunter, and him himself, and then also his other reply with Tim Fox afterwards,
Sure.
I watched every single one, took detailed notes on every single one, and I was talking to Stratton somehow on Facebook, and he was basically saying, "Hey, just wait for my book. Like, stay tuned. I'm going to
Mhm.
explain a lot of this." I'm like, "Okay, like you make a good case. Not convinced, but I really want to look at your book because your articles are kind of like for the layman, and they don't go in detail. So I want the book because I'm expecting it to go into detail." And
Sure.
there's some things he's not going to remember, but I remember. There's some things in personal correspondence that I was like, do you deal with guidance control or Fisher Revisa's contemporary compatibilism? And he kind of alluded to me, at least, to the fact that, yes, anyone who's familiar with the literature will know that I allude to that. And I'm like, oh, great. Like, I want an incompatibilist good reply that has to do with Molinism, and this would be great. When I got the book, I ordered it as soon as I had the money, or as soon as my wife allowed. And then I read it in like, I think 2 weeks or so. And that's why I was so lackluster, because
Okay.
none of what he promised actually cashed out for me. It was
Mm.
virtually, to me, a ripoff of his blogs. It was, and Bignon points this out ad nauseum in his own review, that a lot of it was just his blogs, just regurgitated. Some sections, like the historical section, didn't make any sense. Why do you need that historical section in there? And then he never explained why we need the categorical ability to do otherwise, which I'm going to explain in a bit. So
Okay.
these are some, like, to me, like some issues that I wanted resolved, that I felt like, and maybe my hopes are too high, I don't know, but he did hype it up a lot. We know that.
That's fair.
Maybe he hyped it up so much that I was just expecting too much. I don't know, but that's why I
Mhm.
consider it
Mhm.
lackluster. And then, yes, his rejoinders are better. Yes, I'll admit that his rejoinder to Bignon is a little bit better, but it still doesn't. It doesn't have the philosophical umph that it
Sure.
needs, and
Sure.
that's a problem.
And
So
I would say too that the criticism is of what Stratton has put out is not simply coming from other Calvinists; it's coming from other
yeah,
Molinists as well. So I think
yes,
that's important to keep in mind. So, and I think charity is in place here. I appreciate how when Tim said, "Hey, wait for my response," your attitude of like, "All right, great," because you guys, we know this, that when we're talking about some of these issues, it takes a lot to unpack and to kind of just get it all out. So we
yeah,
want to be charitable, even after watching this. And Tim says, "Hey, I want to have an opportunity to address that." Like, hey, this is an active, topic. We're willing to interact and kind of take the time to kind of plow through the stuff. And so, responses are welcome. That's how we learn. So I do appreciate that attitude that you had, and hopefully the dialogue, if we can say, not that we're talking in the behind the scenes, but hopefully that debate can kind of have a healthy continuation as we continue to move towards
exactly. Yep.
hopefully closer to the truth. So, all right. Well, okay. So you wrote this 300 page monster, which, by the way, a lot of people appreciated. I have some comments here. Someone said, "Thank you for making it available on the internet." Yes, thank you very much. It's the worst when someone writes something and then you have to like go through a paywall and you're like, "I'm too broke to pay for an article. Come on, man." So I appreciate that. It's free.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. So what was your overall aim and the methodology that you took to kind of begin to unpack where you wanted to go with respect to interacting with Tim's work here concerning mere Molinism.
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly. It was dialectical and conversational, hence the title. So I wanted it to be more of a philosophical approach, a compatibilist philosophical approach to Molinism and his overall response. But I also wanted it to be conversational. So there's actually some parts in some sections which I may use less than professional philosophical language because I wanted it to be approachable in that sense. I wanted it to almost seem like a dialogue where, hey, he's saying something, I'm responding to it. What's the next thing he says? This, I'm responding to it. And here's how maybe Beyond said, or some other philosopher or theologian said this. How does that incorporate with Stratton's overall Molinistic framework? Here's how, and then we move on. So I kind of wanted it to be that.
Okay.
Also, I wanted it to be a philosophical defense for compatibilism. And I'm going to highlight that word there, defense. It is not an argument for compatibilism. And I know Stratton has already confused negative and positive argumentation with Bignon himself. You interviewed Bignon about that when their whole consequence argument controversy. And Bignon's like, what? That has nothing to do with the consequence argument. So I want to highlight that part. If you're going to read this 300 pages, don't see it as, where's the argument for compatibilism? It's not there. I will assume compatibilism all the way throughout the whole book. I'll assume determinism all the way throughout the whole book. I'm on the defensive mode, which means who's in the offensive mode? Stratton. He's the one who published the book full of arguments. I'm going to look at those arguments and be defensive. Bignon did the same when he did his review. Review of mere Molinism. So I will pretty much assume something very similar, a similar methodology. And so I do allude to other arguments for compatibilism, such as Bignon's or Vivellin's, which we'll kind of get to a little bit. Anderson's kind of arguments and definitional stuff, or guidance control, that will be in volume 2. But yeah, and so this is a defense, not an argument.
Sure.
I
think that's important to keep in mind. That's a good point there. Just as a heads up, folks, if you're familiar, I think Tim has put something out indicating that he's coming out with another edition to his book. What's the name of the book again? I forgot the name of the book. It's
Human Freedom, Divine Foreknowledge, and Mere Molinism, and he's just gonna call it second edition. I'm pretty sure he's gonna keep the subtitle. So.
Okay. Yeah. So again, if he addresses everything that you're going to be talking about here in there,
I would be happy.
That'd be great. Yeah. So that's fine. So if someone says, hey, man, if you're a fan of Tim's work and you're like, wait a minute, man, you got to wait for the second edition. Like, that's cool. Like, we're down for the second edition. That's
yeah. The issue is the second edition's not out yet. So
right. All right. So let's move down to if we have our outline here. That's kind of the introductory stuff that's out of the way here. We have on the outline libertarianism. Why don't you define some terms for us and then kind of jump into how this relates to the overall approach that you've taken to interact with Tim?
Yeah, so libertarianism is a simple thesis. Libertarianism is just the thesis of incompatibilism and free will some of the time. So what that means is incompatibilism must be true, so you can't be determined and free at the same time. Otherwise, that would be compatibilism. So that needs to be true. And also, a necessary condition for libertarianism is that humans need to possess some sort of freedom some of the time. It doesn't need to be all the time. It doesn't need to be more times than not. It just means some of the time. So it could be one time in their life, or it could be 50 times in their life. It doesn't really matter. It just needs to have some sort of freedom. Okay, so that's the basic definition. And so in section 2.1.1, specifically, and I'm going to throw page numbers out, and I hope that's okay for the audience, so I can follow along. But page 14, Stratton has this claim of libertarian compatibilism, and he's often said that before. Bignon has criticized him in his own review about it, but I agree. Like, so for instance, Stratton says this in page 161 of his book. He says, indeed, given the above definitions of libertarianism, so all the definitions he kind of describes in his book, but by the way, he says, his limited libertarian freedom, which we're going to get into a bit. It's the ability to do something compatible with your nature. So, or consistent or compatible with your nature. So it's not against your nature, it's just compatible with it. So we're going to see what that means. So given those definitions and everything he's explained, Stratton writes, both compatibilism and libertarianism might affirm that some form of libertarian freedom at least occasionally corresponds to reality.
Mhm.
The issue is that's not true, or at least not in the way that he's writing it. He needs to clarify a whole lot in order for that to work. So, for instance, I agree with Bignon, and Bignon writes libertarianism entails incompatibilism, like I said. Therefore, compatibilists cannot ever affirm that anyone has ever had or ever will have libertarian freedom. So that would require incompatibilism,
Okay.
which means compatibilism would be false. So this is the first kind of blunder, and I'm not the only one to critique him on it, so I don't want to spend too much time on. But there is, I want to be charitable. There are some in the literature, and I do have a footnote 20 on page from my reply, footnote 20 on page 14. There are some that respond and call themselves or have called their view libertarian compatibilism. So, and these are good philosophers like Kadri V. Velen, Christian List, even Mealy has somewhat said, hey, they can affirm similar things. But I want to clarify this, just because they can affirm similar things, that, yeah, libertarianism can affirm something about someone's nature and they can't do other than what their nature allows. And just because compatibilism has that same definition doesn't mean that you can just combine the two views and say libertarian compatibilism.
Sure.
I think Stratton has recently already conceded this much as a video in response to Paul Manata, like literally like recent, like within the month. So when I watched that video, I was like, yay.
Yeah, little pom-poms. Yay.
You're getting it. But yeah, so he wants to say that I affirm some freedoms that are compatible with determinism and some freedoms that are not, but the freedom that's necessary for libertarianism or for rational responsibility is what he calls it, he says is not compatible with determinism. And I would say, great, then by definition, you're an incompatibilist. But then he wants to go further, or at least he did, want to go further and say, no, I still can be a compatibilist in some sense and incompatibilist in other senses. And I'm saying it's just not helpful. Like, it's just not helpful. Obviously, I'm an atheist with regards to Zeus. Am I going to go around saying I'm a Christian atheist? That makes no sense, right? Like, you're not going to say that. In the same way, you're not going to go around saying I'm a libertarian compatibilist, because it's just not helpful. Now, he may think he's being helpful to the layman. He's actually not. And the reason why he's not is because those definitions, what I'm explaining to you and everyone else, are standard in the layman free will philosophy books. Like, for instance, like Robert Kane's Contemporary Introduction to Philosophy, or to Free Will Philosophy, back in like 2005. He had like a small book on it. He says the same thing I'm saying. So it doesn't really make sense for him to use these kind of words. And so that's my first critique in that section.
So your critique, so if I can just summarize, so your
Yeah.
critique of Stratton is his use or misuse or irresponsible use or clumsy use of standard definitions, which kind of muddles the whole discussion.
Yeah, yes, yeah, that's precisely it. And I think it's even all the more ironic when he thinks that people like us, I'm going to just say Calvinists or whatever, or compatibilists, muddy the definitions or muddy the waters. No, that's actually ironic because you're the one doing it. And I would stand by that statement. And since he's conceded it recently at the end of his 30-minute video to Paul Manata, I would take that he agrees with me. And so he's going to stop doing this libertarian compatibilism, and he's just going to say, yep, I'm an incompatibilist. I'm a flaming incompatibilist free thinking is what he would call himself, and leave it at that. And I would be like, thank you. Amen. We can move on because the definitions are important.
Okay. So these definitions with respect to how he defines libertarianism, have you heard of the phrase? Have you heard of the term soft libertarianism?
Yeah, so I expand a little bit about it actually in that same footnote 20, I believe. I do say that that is what it is. Soft libertarianism would just affirm what he wants to affirm. So why does he not just use the word soft libertarian? He does in his book, in his chapter 12. He briefly mentions soft libertarianism, but the issue is just say that. Don't keep bouncing around with these, I'm a libertarian compatibilist or whatever. Just say you're soft libertarian. Everyone knows what you mean. Call it good.
I first heard of soft libertarianism from Kirk McGregor when I was a Molinist, and I was part of the Moleness Facebook group where I used to interact with Dr. McGregor and Jonathan Thompson and Tim. That's where I heard soft libertarianism for the first time, and it sounded very similar to compatibilism. If to the untrained ear, it sounds very similar. Can you briefly kind of tell us the difference between compatibilism and soft libertarianism?
Yeah, so Stratton does a little bit, but I think he fubs. Is that a word? Fub up?
Hey, it's the internet. We can make up whatever we want.
He fumbles, I guess, the definition of a compatibilism, but we'll get to that later. But really, the distinguishing factor between soft libertarianism and compatibilism is that soft libertarianism is still, by definition, incompatibilist. So the types of abilities that ground or are necessary for responsibility are just different. So the ability for soft libertarianism that's necessary for rational responsibility or moral responsibility is going to be the categorical. So they still want to say that you categorically could do this or that, A, B, C, D, or not A, not B, not C, whatever. That is the categorical. No matter what kind of view of libertarian you have, no matter how minimalist it is, no matter how mere it is, that must be a condition. And so I actually take great pains in this libertarian section, the first section here, to make that prevalent. I try to argue with regards to libertarianism and indeterminism, that if indeterminism is something that's entailed by libertarianism, indeterminism means more than one future. So what does that mean? It means alternative possibilities. Well, what does that mean? It means you have access to alternative possibilities. What does that mean? Access is the categorical access to be able to actualize this avenue, that avenue, that avenue, that avenue. Compatibilism concedes none of that. So that's the main difference, I would say. It's just the types of abilities, and then obviously the former soft libertarianism is incompatibilist and compatibilism is compatibilist. So.
All right, that makes sense. Just as a heads up, there are some people, I see some in the comments, someone says, you should interview Dr. Kirk McGregor. Well, actually, before my channel got viewers, but I'm not, I mean, I don't know where I am in terms of subscribers now, but when I was much smaller, once upon a time, I actually did interview Kirk McGregor twice, and get this, okay, when I was a Molinist, right? Or when I was struggling with the issue between Molinism and Calvinism, I actually moderated a debate/discussion between Kirk McGregor and Matt Slick of CARM. So if folks are interested, if you just look up Kirk McGregor versus Matt Slick, it is an interesting discussion, to say the least. If I can just, it's a very, very interesting discussion. I think, in my personal opinion, Matt Slick's a friend of mine. I happen to think that Kirk McGregor did an excellent job in that discussion. However, I obviously ultimately don't agree with him at the end. But if you want to hear kind of a good defense or answering various objections to Molinism, that's a great video. So it's not on my channel here on Revealed Apologetics. It was kind of before I got Revealed Apologetics started, but it's there on the internet, so folks could actually check that out if you search. All right, so Colton. Oh, one more thing for folks who are listening. We got a nice crowd here. If you have a question, preface your question with question, and like we normally do at the back end of the show, we'll see if we could address as many as possible if Colton is up to it. Sorry, I didn't say that beforehand. I hope you're okay with it. All right, is that okay? Okay,
yeah, let's do it.
All right, so what about determinism? What is determinism, and is this another category that you find Tim kind of messes up and confuses? How do you think Tim approaches his, how do you think, or how well rather, do you think Tim understands determinism? Does he mess up on the definitions there? What's going on there?
So there's not really. I want to say that he doesn't really mess up libertarianism because obviously it's his view, right? I just don't think he uses standard definitions, and he ought to, especially if he wants to dance in the philosophical arena. And so
Sure.
you ought to use this definitions already in the arena. And if you disagree with those definitions, you ought to give a really good reason why. And I don't find any of Tim's reasons as to why he defines libertarianism the way he does. Good enough reasons. Although, because it's his view, I'll give him it.
Sure.
And I'll show internally why I think his limited libertarian freedom is actually false later. But going back to determinism, no and yes. He defines it as exhaustive divine determinism, which to me is a complete redundancy. Now I understand he has tons of different articles and stuff why exhaustive divine determinism isn't redundant, and I kind of politely scoff at those, because, and the reason is because he doesn't understand, again, the standard definitions. If something is determined, that means that some things can be, and like, let's just say I'm determined to do this. That doesn't mean all things are determined, for sure. It just means that thing is determined.
Mhm.
Well, then if something is determined, that's non-exhaustively determined, but that doesn't mean that's non-exhaustive determinism. The
Okay.
ism is what grants it to all things. I have yet to see any standard philosophical work from laymen to professionals say that, oh yeah, for sure, there's a thing called non-exhaustive determinism. Now, I understand it's his own definition and he wants to try to argue it, but he's doing a terrible job. And I mean that with all love and respect. So what I mean is, what he should just say is, some things can be determined and some things are not determined. Great. That's all you need to say.
Mhm.
You don't need to say that non-exhaustive determinism and exhaustive determinism is existing. He wants to claim rationality, alternative possibilities for rationality, because he is a leeway incompatibilist, which just means he affirms alternative possibilities with regards to the mental deliberations. That's fine. So those can't be determined, okay, but he could concede that everything else could be determined. I don't know how that's possible, and I would expect him to show me exactly how that's possible, but it technically is coherent in some sense. But that's all you need to say, that some things can be determined, some things are not determined, and you don't need to use this exhaustive, non-exhaustive determinism. So I actually developed this all the way throughout my reply, but I call it the mere Moleness dilemma.
Okay.
Very
So real quick before you get into the mere Molinist dilemma, because that's going to be part of the. I mean, the thumbnail says "Rest in peace, mere Molinism." So now you're bringing up. We're getting to kind of the meat here. So you would take issue with. Would you agree with Bignon's criticism of Stratton that the term ed is just an unnecessary redundancy?
Yeah, so I pretty much agree with everything Bignon has to say. I just because we have the same Calvinistic background. I think he
Sure.
leans a little bit more towards Baptist. I'm Presbyterian, but
Okay.
whatever. But basically, with regards to soteriology and the Westminster and everything, yeah, we're going to affirm exactly.
Okay.
And I would say the same thing here. It's a redundancy.
Sure.
So anything Bignon says about Tim Stratton's definitions and how he goes about determinism, I would say the same. But if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. All right, so let's get into the rest in peace mere Molinism. Here's the dilemma.
Yeah.
What's the dilemma for the mere Molinist?
So I explain this throughout most of my chunks. So I started in this section on determinism, which is 2.2, and then I kind of bring it up throughout. So in my Frankfurt style section, and also a little bit in the historical section, because obviously he's a mere Moleness and this is the dilemma. So here's what I write kind of informally, but either the agent while being determined unto salvation is A, not more rationally responsible. So either the agent while being determined unto salvation is either A, not rationally responsible, or B, he is rationally responsible. If horn A, that he's not rationally responsible, then Tim's ed definition to me is a useless redundancy, and the distinction between exhaustive and non-exhaustive would be proven superfluous. Incompatibilism would obtain, and Stratton's project amending mere Molinism with Reformed theology would just be confused, quizzical. Okay, I call that the Calvinist horn. Stratton would be proving that mere Molinism if he affirmed that horn, that the agent is not rationally responsible when he's determined to salvation.
Okay.
If he accepts that horn, Stratton would be proving that mere Molinism is not compatible with tulip, Calvinist soteriology. Contrary to his project, Stratton's whole project is try to harmonize, because he came from a reformed school. So he's trying to harmonize mere Molinism with tulip. So he's trying to say you could be a tuliper like Greg Koukl. He uses as a classic example all the time, and yet still technically be a Moleness. And I say, no, because is Greg Koukl going to accept the fact that he's not rationally or even morally responsible for salvation? Most Calvinists want to say that they are. But here's the problem, and here's horn B. If Stratton concedes that they are rationally responsible during their deliberation while also being determined to salvation, then he gives up his free-thinking argument. Because his free-thinking argument has to say that you cannot be determined and deliberating at the same time. In other words, you cannot be rationally responsible and yet be determined at the same time. You cannot. That's what the free-thinking argument says.
Sure.
So Stratton would give up his argument and therefore leave incompatibilism defenseless. Here's the issue. He's not going to do that. His whole ministries is called free-thinking ministries. So he's not going to fall on horn B. He's going to fall on horn A. But if he does that, then he just throws his Calvinist friends underneath the bus, like Greg Koukl, and says, oh, yeah, you are determined. The I in irresistible grace. Yeah, that I determines your salvation. Your deliberation was not free, not rationally responsible. But here's the problem. I don't see any Calvinists worth their salt actually accepting that.
Sure.
So his whole project, to me, mending them together just does not work. And if that's the case, then what's the purpose of mere in mere Molinism? He wants to say mere Molinism because it mends something, the most modest form of Molinism together with a robust soteriology like Calvinism per se. But if those don't even go, then what's the reason for the caveat on, or the clarifier really on mere? Virtually no reason. And if that's the case, then his Molinism is just like every other Molinism.
Sure.
If that's the case, then why write a book on Molinism when it's not really different than all the other Molinism flavors that are out there?
Sure.
Right. And so I think this dilemma is pretty good to me, and I'm interested in seeing if people want to ask questions about it too. But I'm interested in seeing what Stratton has to say about it. Again, I'll kind of repeat it and summarize. There's the Calvinist horn and free thinking horn. If he wants to say that people can be determined in matters above, is what Kirk McGregor wants to say. So people can be determined in matters above, so in salvation, but not be determined in matters below. So in everyday, like, can I choose red socks or blue socks kind of thing. If Tim Stratton and Kirk McGregor want to say that and give a little wiggle room for their libertarian freedom, I think that you have to say that that person, that agent, while being irresistibly drawn, while deliberating salvation, yet it's a determined salvation, they are either rationally responsible or they are not. If they are not, then you just threw your Calvinist friends underneath the bus. I don't see any Calvinists accepting that. Yeah. And if they are, you just gave away your whole free-thinking argument. Compatibilism is the best option, and compatibilism would be just surrendered.
Yeah, but Colton, you were determined to say all of those things.
Yeah, I hate that response.
Okay, so
I was, if determinism is true.
Yeah. So, okay. So we won't address this now, but maybe you can, because I know there are people who are listening and be like, yeah, but you're just a determinist, so it doesn't matter. Maybe a Leighton Flowers will come and make a 10-hour response video to this or something. I'm just kidding, Leighton. When someone says, but you were determined to say everything you're saying, as a Calvinist, does that make you shake in your boots or uncomfortable in any way, shape, or form? Is that somewhat a response that Calvinists really need to come to grips with?
No. So I think it's kind of comical, and I'm saying this with love and respect, but I think it's comical that is even a response. The reason why I say it's comical is because no professional incompatibilist philosopher ever argues that.
Mhm.
And you would think after the millennia, or specifically after the last 50 years since free will literature has been booming, you would think that an incompatibilist philosopher would say, yes, but they can't deliberate because even their deliberations are determined. Aha!
Mhm.
That just the reason why they don't do that is because it's question begging. It's
Sure.
assuming incompatibilism from the very beginning,
Right.
which is what Tim Stratton and company need to prove. It's his
Mhm.
book. He's an incompatibilist. Prove it to me. And you can't do it without already assuming your incompatibilist presuppositions.
Sure.
Saying that you can't deliberate, what I'm doing right now, I'm deliberating, I'm talking, yet not be determined at the same time. In the literature, it's called deliberation incompatibilism. Kant was a famous one, Thomas Reid was a famous one, and there are plethora of compatibilists and incompatibilists like Dirk Pereboom, who's a hard borders on hard determinism, hard incompatibilism,
Okay.
who are deliberation compatibilists, who ad nauseum has defended the fact that you can deliberate and be uh, determined at the same time.
Hmm.
Stratton touches none of those arguments. I
Do you,
don't need,
do you
honestly,
think
I don't even know
do
if
you
he
think he's aware of those arguments, or do you think
does
he
now.
purposely? Do you think he purposely kind of like? I don't even want to say that. I want to. It is
Um,
confusing that because he should be aware of these arguments and all these other positions. That it's odd that there's no direct interaction in any meaningful way.
yes or no? So first off, I'm not surprised. Kind of, I am surprised, but I'm not necessarily surprised that there's no interaction there. And here's why.
Mm.
In
Okay.
the preface of his study guide to mere Molinism, he says that he wrote the book Mere Molinism for the layman, for the church people.
Okay.
And if that's the case, he's not going to use a lot of objections. He's not going to go into deep literature on the philosophy about it. And that makes sense. But then again, it doesn't make sense because his pupil, his almost like predecessor, William Lane Craig, who he studied under, had a book called The Only Wise God, who was made for laymen and church people. And that book had many objections, had 4 total chapters, if I recall, on
Mm.
objections, detailed philosophy, defending his view against objections. So either Stratton knew about it, but purposely didn't put them in his book because maybe he had dissertation requirements that he needed to meet, which makes
Sure.
sense. Or he just didn't know about them.
Mhm.
But if I go back to the first one, if he did know about them but didn't put them in his book, when he published the book after he did the dissertation and got his PhD, why didn't he just gut out some unnecessary parts like the historical section, put the objections in?
Yeah.
Like it would have done nothing. Like his mere Moleness twin pillar, libertarian freedom and middle knowledge is what mere Molinism really says. Those twin pillars, those 2 things, could have easily just been defended. Actually, I would say arguably defended better, because
Mm.
then you would see, oh, here are objections. Here's my defense against these objections. Instead of going on 140 pages, I think, on historical tangents that virtually do nothing to his overall project, and
Mm.
which he's actually conceding John Calvin recently.
We
It's
got
just
John Calvin back when I was like,
it makes no sense. And
like,
so
don't take Calvin from us. He made that video. I'm like, we got Calvin back. All right.
yeah,
And
so I think he does know about them, and I know I've talked to him personally about them before in personal correspondence. So my hope is in the second edition, he actually discusses Dirk Pereboom, Caruso, Nelkins, Artario. These are all people who have argued for deliberation compatibilism,
sure.
who say you can deliberate and still be and that still is compatible with being determined completely,
Okay.
exhaustively.
Okay.
So here's the hoping. I hope he actually touches some of that literature.
Okay.
But
So to briefly summarize, the mere Moleness dilemma is, in a very casual summary, what's the dilemma? So people can kind of have this crystallized image of what you're getting at here.
the dilemma is just 2 horns. I call it the Calvinistic horn and the free-thinking horn. He either throws his Calvinist friends underneath the bus by saying Calvinists, when they're being determined to salvation through the I and tulip, irresistible grace, if he says that they're not rationally responsible because they can't deliberate about salvation and still be determined to salvation at the same time, he throws them underneath the bus, thus breaking his project of mere Molinism being compatible with Reformed theology.
Okay.
Second horn is the free-thinking horn. He says, yeah, they are rationally responsible, actually. You can be determined under salvation, deliberate, and still be, and that is all compatible with your freedom and rational responsibility. Well, then you just gave up your free-thinking argument. Thanks for the win. I'll take compatibilism and be on my day. So.
All right. Well, I have here on our outline compatibilism, and it says here, point 1, does compatibilism entail determinism? Why don't you unpack that for us? That's kind of the next point here. And
so this is actually a big one, so I kind of want to camp out here a bit. In his book, he said in his philosophical section that for his purposes here in his book, I think it's page 161, I believe, that I could be wrong, but he says that I will make compatibilism entail determinism. And I'm just like, what? I'm shocked that he would actually say something like that. And the reason why I'm shocked is because by definition, compatibilism doesn't entail determinism. Even incompatibilists like Jerry Walls knows this very well. Other incompatibilists like Kevin Tempe know this very, very well. He says it in the introductory first few pages of his book, Free Will. Kevin Tempe says that. So it's a pretty important one to say that, oh yeah, this is what's going to happen, and compatibilism entails determinism,
sure.
when virtually no professional philosopher agrees with you. That's kind of concerning. To me, that's very, very concerning. Now, let's make some distinctions. First of all, actually, let me go back. For instance, some professional philosophers that will just outright deny the claim is a compatibilist Michael McKenna and Dirk Pereboom. So they say this in their Free Will introduction book on page 30, and I have this quoted in the footnotes on page 81. So they say the definition of compatibilism, quoting, the definition of compatibilism does not commit to the truth of determinism. Wow. Would you look at that? They go on and say it tells us that if determinism were true, its truth would not entail that no person ever acts freely. Another compatibilist philosopher, Carolina Sartario, says this: compatibilism doesn't say that determinism is true, but only that it wouldn't undermine our free will if it were true. She continues and says, thus, according to compatibilism, even if we may not know whether or not determinism holds, we needn't worry about it being true because it's not a threat to our free will.
Mm-hmm.
So and I think
a Calvinist can a Calvinist be a compatibilist, but be completely silent as to how they're compatible. So that saying that you're compatibilist doesn't commit you to a metaphysical picture of like causal determinism, which is often voiced. Because I remember I had a conversation with Tim Stratton a while back, and he said that if I were a Calvinist, I would be a Mysterian Calvinist. I would say that, yeah, these things are compatible, but I have no idea how they work out.
Yeah.
Now, what's wrong with that?
So I'm glad you brought that up. I do explain that in the determinism section. I contrast different types of models of determinism. So Mysterian Calvinism and industrious Calvinism. That comes from I believe it's coined by Greg Welty. But he coins those words, and he kind of, in most of his works, he sides with Mysterian Calvinism, though he does believe there is a robust model like guidance control. And I'm an industrious Calvinist, meaning there's no mysterious thing about it. We know how it works. It's called guidance control.
Mm-hmm.
And so people have, you've interviewed Michael Patrick Preciado. He has integrated guidance control with robust Reformed theology.
I love Michael. Michael is literally a Mexican version of Guillaume with better English. If Guillaume says something and I'm just kind of like, what did you say? I'll just ask Michael and he'll explain it.
Yeah, I think Preciado, Michael is great. He's a fantastic individual. His book is awesome. So you should look him up. A Reformed View of Freedom is what that book is called. But anyways, yeah, he argues for an industrious model. So going back to your question, should a Calvinist have an industrious model or not? There's different kinds of terminology here. So another Calvinist have suggested the terminology simple compatibilism,
Okay.
which is basically simple compatibilism is just like what I just said, the thesis of compatibilism, not affirming determinism.
Okay.
And then substantive compatibilism, which is the thesis of compatibilism plus the thesis of determinism. And he argues for that a Calvinist should be a soft determinist or that substantive compatibilist. So we should say compatibilism plus determinism.
Okay.
I agree. Does that mean by definition compatibilism entails determinism? No, it does not. At best, what it means is by application, compatibilism entails determinism, not by definition.
Hmm.
And when Stratton in his book says, "Oh, I just by definition it's going to mean this," and I'm like, "What?" Now, Bignon is so cute, and he actually concedes the entailment, and so I interact with Bignon's concession to Stratton in his own review. So Bignon in his own review says, I'm okay with that. I can see that compatibilism could entail determinism. And then he's like, well, we should see an argument no matter what. I agree. However, I think Bignon gave too much ground up. And the reason why I think he did is because, again, we need to make the distinction between application and definition. I don't think by definition compatibilism could ever entail determinism. It just doesn't make sense. Or when incompatibilists often say, well, compatibilism is just determinism with a cherry on top or with frosting. And actually, Stratton himself has had many articles like that in his Free Thinking Ministries page.
Yeah.
And I think that's just ridiculous. No, it's not. Substantive compatibilists could be, but what they're getting at when an incompatibilist says that is something like compatibilism by definition entails hard determinism. That's what they're thinking in their mind.
Sure.
The problem with that is hard determinism entails incompatibilism. So
Right.
you're literally saying compatibilism entails hard determinism, which entails incompatibilism, which by definition, hypothetical syllogism, you have compatibilism entails incompatibilism. Makes no sense. So like that cheeky argument from layman incompatibilists just don't work. That's why you don't see it in the professional field.
Gotcha.
So should the Calvinist be a determinist? I think so, based on the Westminster. But does that mean that their determinism is entailed by compatibilism? No. I think the compatibilism just comes along for the ride and the determinism comes along for the ride. I think they're two independent theses and that they kind of are wed together in the Calvinist tradition and Reformed Orthodox theology, and they can be separated. So we shouldn't make these unnecessary entailments.
Sure. Now, I just want to put this up on the screen here. So Phil Bear says, Eli and Colton, you should read Proverbs 18:17 and explain why you wouldn't have Tim on the show with you right now. So I'm going to read Proverbs 18:17. And it says, the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. Yes and amen. What you're doing here and what you wrote in your 300-page book is literally the example of Tim making a statement first through his book and you responding. So that's the first point. Number two, Colton can be my witness here in public. Did I not invite Tim Stratton to be on here right now with us today?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I did. That's right. When I had Guillaume Bignon on, I actually invited Tim to come on. As a matter of fact, Tim was present in the comments during the live stream in which he was interacting with Guillaume from the comments. And he actually private messaged me an argument that he wanted me to present. I wanted to make sure Tim was being properly represented. So it was Tim's choice not to come on every time I've invited him. I actually invited him multiple times. Now, granted, the reasons for him not wanting to come on were his own reasons. He's doing a lot of, editing and things he's working on. I get that. I'm the same thing with me. You get busy. I get it. But I have never critiqued Tim without inviting him to come on for some kind of moderated discussion or debate with another guest. So yes, we both would hold to Proverbs 18:17, and we are not guilty of not adhering to that. So he has been invited. Hopefully in the future, he can come on and have a moderated discussion. And the reason why I don't have it, people have asked me, why don't I have it with him? This is not my area of expertise. This is my area of interest. I love talking about this topic, and I've learned a lot from Guillaume, from Colton, from Tyler Vela, and others, Paul Manata. But it's not an issue that I would feel that I would be a legitimate, interlocutor and question and point. I like to listen and ask the questions and navigate kind of the flow of the conversation. So that's why I don't do it. But I've invited him multiple times, and he's still welcome to come back on if he wanted to interact with someone and kind of take these things head on. So just wanted to throw that out there.
I also want to throw out that I've personally emailed him and messaged him before, back a year ago, to try to actually just have a video discussion, not even recorded, just to call him and ask him about some of this stuff.
Yeah.
He's never responded, honestly. And I have the emails and the private messages to back it up. So.
Right. Now, Tim has always been willing to talk to me about it on the phone. He's been,
He likes you too much. He likes you more than me.
Well, I mean, he's like, hey, anytime you want to talk. So I've never had that experience with him. But,
Sure.
but again, for my own purposes, because I like to see the views side by side and interact, it's kind of helpful for me to learn. I've always invited him to come on and interact with someone because that helps me. And I think it helps other people kind of pinpoint the specific areas of either strength or weakness. So, So I mean, and again, I get it. Like maybe Tim doesn't feel called to pursue debate and these sorts of, and that's fine. That's fine too. But it's not as though he hasn't been invited. And if he's unable to come on, that doesn't mean we don't get to talk about these issues nonetheless, because he has published material. So that's free game, especially when Tim, and I mean this respectfully, and you know this, Colton, Tim has often attacked Calvinism in general. So, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean, I've attacked Molinism, I get it, but this is fair game in terms of taking the initiative and saying, hey, someone wrote this and let's talk about it. Let's critique it. So there's no, underhanded, unfair things going on here. Anyone's welcome to come on and discuss these issues if they want to. And respectfully, I do think that Tim has been very generous with his time with me over the phone. And so I do appreciate that. And I do respect the fact that he's working on another edition. He's busy. I get that. That's completely fine. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah.
So at any rate. Okay, so we are coming up to an hour, and I imagine we can't get through this whole outline. So I want to ask two things, and then we'll kind of come to the questions, if that's okay. And if anyone wants, they can read the full, I guess, book. I mean, would you call it a book? I mean, it looks like an article, I guess, but it's literally a book. Well, how would you refer to your work there?
I don't know. I've kind of went back and forth. I don't like calling it a book either, because I think books, like a philosophy book, has to do with like a thesis, and then you're interacting with, you're arguing for something and interacting with people that could have potential objections to your work and to your thesis, and you're trying to defend it in light of that. I don't do any of that, right? I'm just responding to a brother, really. And so that's why I called it a reply. I don't even like calling it a review, because it's not even a review of his book. It's mainly a reply to just mere Molinism. And since Tim is the chief advocate of mere Molinism today, it's really just a reply to his overall philosophy and theology in general.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Just one thing about Molinism in general, and I agree with Guillaume. Out of all the false views, it's my favorite. So there's something about Molinism that always brings me back to like, hey man, it's really fascinating. I wonder how they answer this. And so it's definitely a view that's worth, at least for me, it's worth my time to interact with. I do find it fascinating, and I'm interested in defenses of it. But again, at the end of the day, I'm a convinced Calvinist, and saying I'm determined to be that way doesn't faze me one bit. It shouldn't faze other Calvinists either. So here are my last 2 points here. So, and I do apologize, we can't get through the whole outline, but maybe I'll have you on again for another episode or something like that. That'd be cool. Okay, so in terms of turning the table, in terms of not critiquing Molinism, actually, no, I'm going to save that for the second part. Let's deal with Molinism here. So mere Molinism. If you can summarize, I could just let you blab right now. I'm going to ask this and just let you run. do you think that Molinism is flat out false or improbable? The argument isn't strong enough. Do you have like a defeater for Molinism? How would you right now, someone says, hey, refute mere Molinism or Molinism in general, how would you unpack that from a more, I know you don't have like an outline or notes, whatever, but how would you begin to engage in a refutation? Some people take the approach of bringing up the grounding objection. Other people bring the approach of saying, hey, if libertarian free will is one of the pillars of Molinism, let's attack libertarianism. What should be the tactic of the Calvinist who's interacting with the Molenist and wants to kind of engage and, and show why one shouldn't hold it?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I'm not a fan of the grounding objection. I think it's kind of old news, and so
okay.
And neither even the people in the debate, like Flint and Hasker, they're just like they're not getting anywhere in the debate. If you read their replies, they're just at a stalemate. So I think that's kind of a dead end, but there is some work still being produced on it. But to me personally, I would attack libertarian freedom. That's the first thing. Okay. So I just don't find that the categorical ability necessary for rational responsibility is just necessary. Like, it's a very strong position to say that you need the liberty of contradiction or the ability to have true beliefs over false beliefs in order to be rationally responsible, which is what Tim Stratton wants to say. It's a very strong claim, and which, at least in mere monism, I see virtually no support of at all, no independent support, at least not support that doesn't entail question begging. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is I would actually take something like Hasker's bring about argument or Welty's gunslinger. I understand Stratton has dealt with Welty's gunslinger analogy before, but I don't think he understands necessarily. I'm saying that respectfully, but I don't think he understands Welty's gunslinger analogy. He doesn't get the fact of what he's trying to say. So basically, that argument is like similar to the bring about, where there's virtually almost no difference between Calvinist deterministic providence and Moleness deterministic providence. All said and done, there's virtually no difference between the providences. You still have a God who ought to be labeled as some ought to have some sort of collective responsibility attached to it. Let's just say that. I don't want to get too much into it, but let's just say that. And of course, the Calvinist denies it, but the Moleness usually likes to pin it on the Calvinist, saying, no, author evil, see, determinism. And I would just say, the Moleness is in the same boat. So pick a different argument.
Yeah.
So I think those arguments are good.
So when you say that you don't think that the categorical ability to do otherwise is necessary for, what did you say, rational responsibility?
Yeah, because that's what Stratton likes to say, rational.
But you would also say moral responsibility as well.
He says so he says moral responsibility entails rational responsibility, which to me makes no difference. Like, okay, so I can concede that. Doesn't matter. What's necessary for rational responsibility has got to be necessary for moral responsibility. So if you think that alternative possibilities in the deliberation process is entailed by rational responsibility, if moral entails rational, well, then you have a hypothetical syllogism. Moral entails the same alternatives. That's what I argue in my reply here, but he's still going to say rational, so I just use the term rational.
Okay, so when you say, so if we could define our terms briefly here, so we can talk about two senses of ability, right? So when people appeal to the idea of the ability to do otherwise, there's a distinction between what we call conditional ability to do otherwise and categorical ability to do otherwise. So categorical ability to do otherwise is what Tim would hold, is what libertarians would hold, is what incompatibilists would hold. So they believe that determinism and moral responsibility or rational responsibility is incompatible. You need the ability to do otherwise in a categorical sense. All things being equal, you can choose other than what you in fact choose. Have I got it?
Yeah, the issue is Stratton's going to try to push back. So I try to, and I really, really hope that those who are listening actually does take the time, because we're just doing a brief summary on all my claims, really, not even all of them, but on a lot of the arguments. I argue, and Jonathan Thompson, who I believe is in the chat, he would say it, he would agree with me. I argue ad nauseum all these different kinds of objections that Tim could respond to. And he's going to respond like, well, we don't need the alternative possibility condition all the time.
Okay.
Or something like sources, all that's necessary, or something like that. In my libertarian section, to me, I'm going to be humble, but I am confident that I defeat that square in the face.
Mhm.
No, you need the alternative possibility. If you're a libertarian, the necessary condition is indeterminism. Indeterminism, by definition, entails alternative possibilities, which means, by definition, you need some sort of alternative possibilities, whether they're weak or strong, somewhere in your causal history. All incompatibilists say this. Even Kevin Tempe, who's a source incompatibilist, would argue that some sort of alternative possibilities are necessary in the causal history of the agent. So it's just the case whether they're weak or strong. Now, that's the first thing. I think you can't just have sourcehood. Second thing is, Stratton does argue that leeway is necessary in his own prize limited libertarian freedom definition. So to me, you need alternatives to be able to believe truth over falsehood. So you need to have an alternative to take the truth route or the falsehood route when you're deliberating. Well, that's alternatives, right? So you need the alternative possibility. Now, Stratton will also push back and say, well, the categorical, I don't use the word categorical that much. He's actually, in personal correspondence, he's literally said that line to me. I stopped using the word categorical. Here's the problem. In your book, podcasts, articles, everywhere, besides your rejoinder and new work, you've used the word categorical everywhere. Like everywhere. In the book, in the first 4 pages, he starts dropping the categorical. Okay, so the issue is he wants to now use in the rejoinder to Bignon this idea of broad and narrow abilities, which is basically a dispositional analysis. So it's not a conditional, it's not a categorical analysis, it's a conditional analysis. Here's the problem. Libertarians cannot use the dispositional analysis as necessary, well, as sufficient conditions for responsibility. They can concede the necessity of a disposition, like a disposition is like if I drop a sugar cube in water, it's going to dissolve. So it has the disposition to dissolve in water if it were to be dropped into water. That's kind of like the basics of disposition.
Sure.
But he argues the broad and narrow ability in his rejoinder to Bignon completely negates the fact that the categorical is there. And I'm just sitting here like, what? Like, why? Why? Because the libertarianism is a strong view. It must have the categorical. And so he doesn't really explain too much in the rejoinder to Bignon, but as far as I can tell, that's the only ability he thinks is sufficient and necessary for rational responsibility. And that's just plain false because, well, guess what? The compatibilists can say the same thing. So then what distinguishes his view between the compatibilist view? He needs something that distinguishes his view in the terms of ability between the compatibilist and the libertarian, incompatibilist and compatibilist, and that is the categorical analysis. So no matter what, no matter how he defines it, he cannot get away from the categorical analysis. He must hold to something categorical in the deliberative process.
All right, excellent. There's a lot to chew on, and I hopefully a lot of the name drops that you've given throughout the this interview here, this discussion, people could check those out and check out the work that's related to that. So you're doing a great job, man. Appreciate it. Folks, we're gonna transition to the Q&A session. Just want to give a shout out to MJ Jackson. Thank you so much for your $5 super chat. We'll ask your question first. Do appreciate it. And we have a pretty decent audience here. We only got 4 likes. What's up with that, man? If you like this discussion, but click those like buttons. That's super, super helpful. Lets me know if you guys are jiving with the discussion. So I'd appreciate that. But MJ, with his first question here, do you interact with Romans 7 regarding compatibilism? Does that ever enter into your things have you written down, or maybe just in your own personal studies?
I've thought about it. I haven't necessarily written anything on it because, I mean, Stratton has never really written anything on it. So far, I mean, I've thought about it, and I haven't really seen a clean, detailed response from an incompatibilist using that as an argument against compatibilism. So I just kind of assume, and I'm okay with saying that, I kind of assume that guidance control or other theories of compatibilism, at least most, could probably accommodate Romans 7. Maybe not the conditional ability, but I agree with Bignon. The conditional ability is not sufficient for responsibility anyways. It's just necessary.
Sure.
So even then, it wouldn't matter.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Phil Bear says, what's the difference between a defense and an argument in your eyes? So you did make a distinction between defending and actually providing an argument.
Yeah, defense is negative argumentation, so it's arguing against a view when someone else has the burden of proof. So to me, I think of like a court case. So the prosecution has the burden of proof, the defense does not, right? So the defense can technically just assume that his client is innocent all the way through, even if he knows his client is guilty. He can assume that the client is innocent all the way through, and he doesn't have the burden of proof, and then just argue some made up story. I mean, that happens in court cases all the time. So you don't necessarily need to have believe what you're saying in order to defend against it. You can just defend. Now, obviously, I believe in compatibilism and I defend compatibilism. But the long story short is a defense is negative argumentation, whereas an argument is what we would call positive argumentation.
Okay.
So Stratton has laid out arguments for his view, saying, I positively am arguing for this, not negatively arguing against something else. And so if he's positively arguing for incompatibilism, then that is a positive argumentation, and he would be arguing at the same time against compatibilism. An example for defense and not an argument is something like Bignon's response to the consequence argument. So he responds using the conditional and categorical, and so he doesn't have the burden. So he can question beg and say that. And I know it sounds weird because he doesn't have the burden. Like, can you really talk in circles? And the idea is kind of yes, he can assume the conditional ability when he's responding to the consequence argument. Why? It's not his burden.
Sure.
But let's just say the tables are turned and he has to now argue for compatibilism. Is he going to argue for the conditional? No, and he doesn't do that in his book. He argues it differently because he knows now he can't question beg the conditional. He has to have independent reasons for it. He realizes he doesn't have independent reasons for the conditional, so he doesn't argue for the conditional. He argues like the Pelagian argument or Edwardsian argument or something like that. And so these are just like mild differences. In volume 2, which will come out hopefully later this year with my reply to Stratton, I have a whole section on Stratton and Bignon, like literally,
Okay.
and their controversies throughout the year. And I detail this, that Stratton misunderstands that. He misunderstands a defense and an argument, and that muddies the waters with his conversations with Bignon.
All right. Thank you for that. I'm not sure if you'll understand this question because I don't know the context here, but Danny asks, did he, I suppose you, give motivations for why he's trying to make sense or preserve of two senses of freedom? I don't know.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I understand. Okay. He's saying, did Stratton give motivations for why he's making the distinction between non-exhaustive and exhaustive, or you can be compatible in some ways and not others? And the idea is, yes, he has, but it doesn't matter. So let's just take compatibilism. He wants to say that compatibilism could obtain at some time and incompatibilism could obtain at some other time. So non-exhaustive incompatibilism or compatibilism. So he's saying in some freedoms are compatible with determinism and some freedoms are not. Which ones are not? Rational deliberation. So he's going to die on that hill because that's the hill his free thinking arguments on. Stratton's free thinking arguments on, and he's going to say that is absolutely incompatible with determinism. I'm going to die on that. But some other freedoms, like lesser freedoms, are compatible. Like he says, ordering tacos or ordering at a restaurant or something. And the idea is, yes, that's true. Robert Kane has also conceded this. Compatibilists have conceded this too. Here's the problem: we don't care. What is the responsibility that we care about? Deserving praise or blame in either your rational deliberations or your moral actions. What kind of responsibility does Stratton say is incompatible with that? All kinds. So when he says, he tries to give wiggle room saying, oh, well, I'm a compatibilist too, and this, I just look at that and I'm like, why do I care? No compatibilist cares about that. And I'm saying this kind of bluntly, but I'm being truthful. And I've told him this in personal correspondence because it's just no one cares about that. No compatibilist is going to say, oh, yeah, you're right. That's true. You can be compatible while ordering tacos but not compatible while rationally deliberating whether or not to order tacos.
Mm-hmm.
It's just trivial. Yes, it's true, but it's trivial, and compatibilists don't care about that kind of responsibility. So why bring it up in the first place? Especially if you're trying to not muddy the waters and bridge the gap between Calvinists, Molinists, and incompatibilists and compatibilists. You're not doing a good job if you're going to do it that way. We care about rational responsibility in the desert sense, just like he does. We say it's compatible with determinism. He says it's not. Leave it at that. Argue that instead of bringing up all these unnecessary stuff. It's meaningless.
All right. Thank you for that. Irresistible Truth says, we love Eli's laugh. Thank you so much. I laugh really loud. So sorry I'm not blowing anyone's ears out. So the free thinker, Tyler asks a question. How would you respond to Stratton's claim that God predestines everything, even sin, but this isn't deterministic? I'm going to read that again because that's a good question. How would you respond to Stratton's claim that God predestines everything, even sin, but this isn't deterministic?
I think I've talked to Tyler about this before, but I have a footnote in the early in the determinism section, and I actually, maybe I'm awful, but I actually concede Stratton's claim here because I just have bigger fish to fry, I guess.
Okay.
So I just concede and say, for the benefit of the doubt, let's just give him that. Let's just say, yes, predestination. You can have predestination without having something being determined. It just depends on whether or not you think both are necessary for providence. And obviously, he doesn't think determinism is necessary for providence. He thinks predestination is. The open theist would disagree in some sense, right? But I actually give him that. The idea, though, is, or what I'm kind of thinking in the back of my mind is the same thing that Bella is thinking, that it just really doesn't make sense. If you predestine something, you are the sufficient condition for that happening. Now, you could say there's other sufficient conditions like libertarian free creatures, but then I would expect a better model to see how he can how he can predestine libertarian free creatures in such a way as to not violate their freedom, but yet get them to do what they do, especially when something like the cross or the crucifixion or prophecy is involved. That's a little bit more tricky. Stratton does none of that. So, I mean, take it or leave it. I concede the claim in my book because I want to deal with other stuff, but I would agree with Bella here. There's virtually no distinction.
All right, Tyler has another question here. I'm just going down in order. What is lost from the force of Molinism by Stratton's mere Molinism that eschews the metaphysical commitments Molinism makes in the literature? What is lost from the force of Molinism by Stratton's mere Molinism that eschews the metaphysical commitments Molinism makes in the literature? That's a lot of Molinism.
Yeah, if I'm understanding him correctly, I think I may have already answered it.
Okay.
But I don't know. I would say, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I would say the categorical. Stratton wants to get rid of the categorical and say instead a dispositional ability and opportunity or whatever. Doesn't work for him. Not in his kind of argument for the free thinking argument. So he loses the force of his mere Molinism, and hence my dilemma, the Calvinist horn or the free thinking horn. When he does that, I think that's how I think I'm understanding the question correctly.
All right. Just a real quick shout out to Jonathan Thomas. He says, "Hey, Colton," and "Hi, Eli." Hello, Jonathan. I hope you're doing well. Jonathan's a good guy here. We're moving along. How are you doing? Gary, you have time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, let's go. Let's do it.
Okay. Now you got to find them. People do not preface. No, everyone hasn't prefaced their question with question. Apologize if I skip over anything here. Yeah, well, there's not a question, but a statement. Tim says he's a Calvinist. Does Tim say that? Or unless slamming.
He says he's reformed.
Reformed. Okay.
He doesn't say he's Calvinist, and so to me, that doesn't make any sense either. Now, granted, an Arminian, I guess, could be a reformed. It just depends on definitions. Hence, my whole volume is about definitions. So he does say he's reformed, but he doesn't say he's Calvinist. So he is a Moleness, hardcore. So.
Okay. All right. Phil Bear is making a point here that we're being uncharitable. by doing this. I wonder if we can kind of interact with that biblical principle that was mentioned before. It says, you're missing the point. He's kind of in conversation with someone else. It's how people present the material that matters. They don't give Tim the benefit of the doubt, and that's uncharitable. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the benefit of the doubt. I mean, we've both had personal interactions with Tim. And we listened to him. I've listened to his multiple videos defending his view. I mean, I don't see how we're not giving him the benefit of that. He's been invited to come on. I mean, I don't know what to say to
me,
that.
this is just maybe a rhetorical ploy, but there's no foundation to it. I have Jonathan Thompson, who is in the chat. I've talked to him personally. He used to write for Tim in Free Thinking Ministries, and he has many screenshots of many conversations I've had with Tim where I am trying to be as charitable as possible, almost too charitable, to the point where it makes Jonathan kind of sick because I should push back a little bit more.
Sure.
I've given Tim so much benefit of the doubt, so much so that the reason why it's 300 pages is because I give him so much benefit of the doubt. He could respond this way. If he does respond this way, what's my response? 10 more pages. He could respond this way. If he doesn't respond this way, he could respond this way. So what's my response? 10 more pages. I go throughout and I steel man this Tim Stratton's work as best as I possibly can. That's, to me, the most charitable I can be in a conversation like this.
And there's nothing wrong too. There's nothing like nefarious about what we're doing here. I mean, even Tim, I think Tim would agree when you have published work, like that's fair game to interact with. Like that's what it's there for. So you can interact with it. So I don't think there's any uncharitability going on.
And I would expect nothing less from this man right here or Tim himself to basically get on a channel with Tim Fox, his brother, and just say, yeah, let's critique Eli and Colton's video. And I'd be like, great, let me watch it. Let me take detailed notes and let's respond to it. Like I would expect nothing less. The only thing I should say is read my 300-page reply, or at the very least, look through the table of contents and see how much I really do give him the benefit of the doubt. I concede a lot to that man. Throughout the 300 pages. And then I try to show through my concessions, through my steel manning, not straw manning, through my arduous quoting him, almost annoying quoting him, I try to show why he's wrong. That is charitable. That's giving him the benefit of the doubt.
And that's what we're supposed to be doing. Like obviously you're critiquing a view. Like that's you don't unless you're reading uncritically, right? So all right. Thank you for that. Still appreciate Phil Bear, your comment there. Thank you for reminding us the importance of that principle found in Proverbs. I think that is important. Irresistible Truth says, a joke is that Molinism is determinism light. Doesn't Molinism entail determinism at the end of the day? God chooses the options, knowing people will go to heaven or hell, etc.
So I want to be careful here because I want to say yes or no. There's other Molenists. I think compatibilists are often accused of being Pharaoh's magicians. That's what Jerry Wallace have called compatibilists, because we have tricks up our sleeve and we can kind of maneuver around objections. I think Molenists can do the same, which is why I love Molinism. So, they can be very sly and
it's squirrely, right? There's some little caveats that, and some of them are brilliant. I think, like man, that's a great response.
So I want to say yes. I want to just say the bring about argument is where I'd probably, if pushed, I would put my stakes on the bring about argument from Hasker or Welty's gunslinger. And that's as much as I can say, or as close as I can say, that Molinism becomes determinism. But I would never say Molinism actually is determinism. I would just say it is analogous, or to me that there's no relevant similarity, or at best, even better, there is one relevant similarity between that. That's, I think, a better argument than just saying it entails it. Because I think the entailment can get tricky, because then there's like necessary entailments and that's hard logistically, but I could bring it about with a analogy, and I think that's what Welty tries to do in others. So
Okay, thank you for that. Ryan Brown asked the question, what would Colton's response be on the opportunity to do otherwise that some incompatibilists would argue?
Yeah, so Franklin is probably the number one incompatibilist he's thinking about here, Chris Franklin. And I would say it's a good argument. I think it's better than the consequence argument. So Franklin's no opportunity argument is better. However, uh, just like every libertarian, they can't dance around the categorical. You have to assume the categorical. How do I know that? Franklin, who is a dispositional kind of incompatibilist and who wants to affirm something like the opportunity to do otherwise, he himself responds to the luck objection by using the categorical. So, in order to defend his libertarianism, he has to defend it using the categorical. So, to me, it's when he argues for libertarianism using the dispositional analysis, it's just kind of odd. Like, I just don't understand why he's using that. I get it. He wants to make minimal room for libertarianism and have a new age argument, whatever, and I respect him for it. But it's still he needs the categorical somewhere, and then it just falls back into the consequence argument.
Hmm.
So I kind of explained that in my section on broad ability and dispositional analysis underneath responsibility, ability, and Frankfurt style examples in that section 2.4. But I also want to say that compatibilists have argued that the dispositional ability is possible underneath compatibilism. So let's just say an incompatibilist says, oh, the dispositional ability is possible underneath incompatibilism. Great. So can the compatibilists. They can say the same thing. What's the difference?
Yeah.
If there's no difference, then like that's why I think you have to boil back down to the categorical for the incompatibilist, which makes the difference. And then we can see, here's the difference. And then give me an independent reason for why the categorical is necessary for rational responsibility. I don't have it. So, yeah.
Sure. All right. Thank you for that. Jarrell Lemus says, I may have missed it, but where can I find the writings of Colton Carlson? Where can people go to actually maybe download or maybe on a website or something like that where they can find your 300-page home?
Academia edu. So you can do that's it's free account that you can make, and you can download it free there. Academia edu. You can just search my name, Colton Carlson, philosophy, or a brief philosophical response, or brief philosophical and dialectical inquiry. And then I should pop up, and then you can download it. It's 300, and it's hyperlinked, so you can click on the contents and everything. If you don't want to read all of it, just go through the section you want to read, click on it, takes you right there. I try to make it like that. So there's number one. And number two, I have not really written responses, but a lot of videos on YouTube on the Freed Thinker. So Tyler Vella's show, some podcasts there, some audio recordings. Irresistible Truth, I've done some videos there against some incompatibilists. And then I have my own podcast that's kind of still working. My buddy just had a baby, so we've been kind of not doing anything lately. But
Sure.
It's called Truth C Squared because Colton Carlson. I don't know. I thought it was cute. Truth C Squared. And then I have some podcast episodes where I kind of explain my view of providence and determinism and some objections to my model of a free will compatibilist defense.
Sure. Awesome. Well, that's the final question on the list here. Rest in peace, mere Molinism? Probably not. It's probably going to be continually debated, which is fine, right? This is fruitful discussion. It's an in-house debate discussion. What I encourage people to do, though, is to continue to have these debates and use them as an opportunity to practice gentleness and respect in the midst of disagreement. It's okay to disagree. You shouldn't be offended, right? Every time I kind of scroll through YouTube or whatever, sometimes I'll find someone made a video about something I said. I'm like, oh snap, someone made a review video. It's like, it's easy to the first knee-jerk reaction is to be offended. But you know what? Not everyone's going to agree, and that's okay. As long as we're able to navigate it in a way that's honoring to Christ, I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Colton, I would definitely love to have you back on. I was thinking I think a couple of episodes ago, I had what I titled the Epic Precept Roundtable. I want to do something similar and call it the Epic Calvinism Roundtable. And maybe I'll have you on with a bunch of other people, some unlikely guests that I can hopefully convince to come on. Would you be interested in doing something like that in the future?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's try to set it up.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you've done a great job. And folks, just looking at the comments, folks have benefited from this conversation a lot. So if you enjoyed this conversation, I know I did. I'm learning, and I'm definitely going to go back and finish reading Colton's book. I keep accidentally calling it an article, but if you guys enjoyed this, share it, talk about it, and continue to engage in the comments. I hope this has been beneficial. So that's it for this episode, guys. Thanks again, and God bless. Bye-bye.